Ava Carter was used to traveling. At just 14 years old, she had already flown more times than she could count, from coast to coast and across continents, visiting exotic destinations with her family. But this time was different. This time, she was flying alone, a direct flight from New York to London for a summer program her parents had arranged. It was a big deal for her. The first time she'd be on a long-haul flight without her father, Michael Carter, by her side. But she wasn't worried. She had a first-class ticket, priority boarding, and a luxury seat waiting for her. Or so she thought. The trouble started the moment she stepped into the first-class cabin. Ava had barely placed a foot past the curtain when a blonde-haired flight attendant in a crisp uniform stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Excuse me, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "You must be lost. Economy is down that way." She gestured toward the back of the plane, without even checking Ava's ticket. Ava blinked, caught off guard. "No, I have a first-class ticket," she said, holding up her boarding pass. The flight attendant barely glanced at it before shaking her head, smiling condescendingly. "Oh, honey, I think you made a mistake. This section is reserved for first-class passengers only." Heat rushed to Ava's face. "I am a first-class passenger." The flight attendant's smile faltered. She snatched the boarding pass from Ava's hand and studied it, her eyes narrowing. Then her lips pursed. "Where did you get this?" Ava's brows furrowed. I bought it." The flight attendant let out a small, skeptical laugh. "I don't think so." She crossed her arms. "Listen, sweetheart, I'm not sure who gave this to you or what misunderstanding happened, but you can't be here. First class is for paying customers only." Ava felt a knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. She had never been treated like this before. She knew exactly what the woman was implying, that she, a young black girl, couldn't possibly afford to sit in first class, that she didn't belong here. "Ma'am," Ava said, struggling to keep her voice steady, "this ticket is real. I didn't sneak in. My dad bought it for me." The flight attendant sighed, rolling her eyes. "Look, I don't want to argue with you, but you need to go back to your assigned section. If you refuse, I'll have to call security." Ava's breath hitched. Security? Passengers in first class were starting to stare, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. The humiliation burned through her chest like fire. A man in a business suit, sitting in seat 3A, lowered his newspaper and frowned. "She showed you her ticket," he pointed out. "Why don't you just check the system instead of assuming?" The flight attendant's face tightened. She ignored him. Instead, she reached for Ava's arm, ready to escort her out herself. That's when Ava did something that changed everything. She pulled out her phone. "I need to make a call," she said, dialing. "Who are you calling?" The flight attendant snapped. Ava locked eyes with her as the line rang. "My dad." And with that, she lifted the phone to her ear, waiting for Michael Carter, the CEO and owner of the airline, to pick up. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. A deep, familiar voice came to the line. "Hey, sweetheart, everything okay?" Ava took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening around her phone. The flight attendant still stood in front of her, arms crossed, face twisted in growing annoyance. The entire first-class cabin was watching now, passengers shifting uncomfortably as the tension grew thick in the air. "No, Dad," Ava said, her voice shaking, but not with fear, with controlled anger. "I'm not okay. The flight attendant won't let me sit in first class. She says I don't belong here." A silence stretched on the other end of the line, a dangerous silence. Then Michael Carter's voice came back, calm but firm. "Put her on the phone." Ava tilted her head, extending the phone toward the now impatient flight attendant. "He wants to talk to you." The woman let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't think so. I have a job to do. I can't waste time on personal calls." Ava's stomach twisted with rage. "You might want to take this call." The flight attendant sighed dramatically, snatching the phone. "Hello, this is Deborah Harrison, head flight attendant on." Then she froze. Her entire demeanor changed in the span of a heartbeat. Her smug confidence evaporated, replaced with wide-eyed panic. Her mouth opened and closed, her face draining of all color as she listened to whatever Michael Carter was saying on the other end. "I know, sir, I didn't realize." She swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. "Of course, sir. Right away. No, I understand. I apologize, sir." The entire first-class section watched in confusion as the once arrogant woman turned into a nervous wreck. She slowly handed the phone back to Ava, her hand shaking. Ava pressed at her ear. Her father's voice was sharp, controlled, lethal. "Sit in your seat, sweetheart. No one is going to bother you again. I'll handle the rest." Ava slid her phone into her pocket, then turned her full attention to the flight attendant, who no longer looked so powerful. "Now," Ava said coolly, "I'd like to take my seat. Unless there's a problem?" The woman stiffened, swallowing her pride. "And no, of course not, Miss Carter. Right this way." Ava walked past her, shoulders squared, not missing the whispers among the first-class passengers. Some were shaking their heads at the flight attendant's blatant discrimination, others pretending they hadn't witnessed the scene at all. The business traveler in 3A, the one who had spoken up earlier, gave her a small nod of approval. Ava leaned back in a luxurious first-class seat, the scent of expensive leather filling the air. She took a deep breath, but the tension hadn't left her body. Her fingers still trembled slightly from the humiliation she had just endured. A first-class passenger with a legitimate ticket, being denied her seat. She had read about things like this happening, seen viral videos exposing outright discrimination, but she never thought she'd experience it firsthand. And yet, here she was. As she stared out the large cabin window, she could still hear the whispers from other passengers. Some people looked guilty, as if they should have spoken up. Others kept their heads buried in their newspapers or pretended to be deeply invested in their champagne and warm towels. But the worst part, the flight attendant, Deborah Harrison, kept stealing nervous glances at her. She knew she had screwed up, that much was clear. But Ava wasn't going to let this slide. Her father wouldn't either. The captain's call. Barely 10 minutes later, while the plane was still taxiing on the runway, a flight officer appeared in the first-class cabin, his expression tense. He was tall and sharp-looking, with silver streaks in his hair and an air of authority. His eyes scanned the passenger list in his hand, then landed on Ava. "Miss Carter?" he said, his voice polite but laced with urgency. Ava looked up. "Yes." He took a breath. "Your father has requested that we delay takeoff." At that moment, every head in first class turned toward her. The businessman in 3A raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A woman in 2C whispered something to her husband. Even Deborah, the flight attendant, looked stunned, her face turning bright red. The officer cleared his throat. "Our CEO has ordered that all senior staff members on this flight report to him immediately before we proceed. That includes the flight crew." Ava felt her lips curl into a small, satisfied smile. Now it was Karen, the flight attendant's turn to panic. I'm the head flight attendant," Deborah stammered, shifting from foot to foot. The officer gave her a cool stare. "Yes, that means you need to come with me." Her face went pale. The walk of shame. The first-class cabin watched in silence as Deborah hesitated. She looked humiliated, her entire body rigid with discomfort. She didn't want to go, but she had no choice. Slowly, she unfastened her polished name badge, straightened her uniform, and began the longest walk of her life down the aisle, following the officer. The whispers around the cabin grew louder. The business traveler in 3A smirked and muttered, "That's what happens when you mess with the wrong passenger." Ava pretended not to hear him, but inside, she was grinning. She leaned back into her seat, stretched her legs, and pulled out her phone to text her dad. "Ava," they pulled the flight crew, "you didn't have to do all that." Smirking face. "Dad, oh, I did. She disrespected my daughter. I'll see you in London. Enjoy the flight." "Ava, what are you going to do?" "Dad, handle it." She couldn't help but laugh softly to herself. When Michael Carter said he was going to handle something, it usually meant someone's entire career was about to implode. The reckoning at 30,000 feet. The plane sat on the tarmac for another 30 minutes, waiting for the flight crew to return. People were getting restless, but Ava, she was completely at ease. Then, just as she was starting to doze off, the flight captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. There was a personnel issue that required immediate attention." A pause. "We will now be proceeding with our flight. Thank you for your patience." The aircraft finally began its ascent, but when Deborah returned to the first-class cabin, she was no longer the same woman. Her usual smugness was gone. Her face was tight, her movements stiff. She avoided eye contact with every single passenger, especially Ava. Something had happened behind the scenes, and Ava had a feeling she knew exactly what. The final blow. By the time the flight landed in London, Ava's phone buzzed with a new message from her dad. "Dad, check the airline's website." Frowning, she pulled up the news section of the airline's official website, and there it was. Statement from Skyline Airlines. "Effective immediately, we have begun a thorough review of our first-class service procedures following an incident involving one of our passengers and a senior flight attendant. Skyline Airlines is committed to ensuring that all passengers receive equal treatment, regardless of race, age, or background." Ava's heart pounded. Her dad had made this public. Ava quickly checked the internal staff memos, something she had access to thanks to her family's connection to the airline. Her jaw dropped. Deborah Harrison, head flight attendant. Suspended pending review. Mandatory sensitivity training for all flight crews. First-class passenger treatment policies under new revision. Ava sat stunned. Her father had not only corrected the injustice, but he had made sure this would never happen again. The flight attendant hadn't just been removed from the flight. She had been placed under investigation for discrimination. Ava bit her lip, a satisfied warmth spreading through her chest. Somewhere in the depths of the airport, Deborah Harrison was probably packing up her things, realizing she had messed with the wrong girl. Ava exhaled slowly. For once, she felt heard. For once, she felt seen. She stood, grabbed her carry-on bag, and stepped off the plane, walking with her head held high, knowing she had just won a battle that was so much bigger than her. Epilogue. Karen learns her lesson. A week later, Ava's father sent her a final update. "Dad!" Deborah resigned. She was facing termination. Ava. "Wow. Guess she finally realized she messed up." "Dad, some people have to learn the hard way." Ava. "Good." Ava leaned back in her bed, feeling lighter than she had in days. Sometimes justice came slow, but when it did, it was unstoppable.